The grand hall inside the Kremlin palace shimmered under towering chandeliers, their light glinting off the polished marble floors and the gold-trimmed walls. The room had been staged perfectly. Rows of hand-selected officials, military brass, and loyalists filled the velvet chairs, each of them trained to applaud at the right moments and nod in agreement when the cameras swept across their faces. But tonight, someone unexpected had taken a seat among them. Near the back, half hidden behind a thick column, sat an unremarkable man. Gray hair slightly overgrown, cheap wire-rimmed glasses slipping down his nose, a suit that looked like it came from a second-hand shop. His posture was stiff, his face expressionless. No one gave him a second glance, which is exactly what he wanted, because beneath the bad wig and bargain suit sat none other than Vladimir Putin himself, disguised to blend in with his own audience. For years, his speeches had played to controlled rooms filled with scripted applause, forced smiles, and a loyalty that came more from fear than admiration. But tonight, Putin didn't want the staged version of reality. He wanted to know what they really thought, what they whispered when they believed no one important was listening. And within minutes, what he would hear would leave him furious. The velvet curtain at the front of the hall swept open, and the real Vladimir Putin stepped onto the gleaming stage. A perfectly rehearsed wave, a slight smile, not too warm, not too cold. And then, the national anthem thundered through the speakers. Every person in the room rose to their feet, clapping in unison, their expressions a polished mask of loyal devotion. In his chair near the back, the disguised Putin clapped along, slower than the rest, his eyes scanning the faces around him. He recognized some of them immediately: top generals, governors, economic advisors, all sitting up straight, faces frozen in admiration, knowing the cameras were on them. But behind the masks, Putin knew there were cracks. On stage, the official speech began. Putin's voice, steady, confident, filled the hall, talking of strength, resilience, and how Russia would continue to stand proud against Western enemies. The audience clapped at all the right beats, the same forced applause Putin had seen at every major event for decades. But from his hidden seat, the disguised Putin could hear something the microphones never picked up. The whispers. Two military officers in the row ahead of him leaned toward each other. "Same speech as last year," one muttered. "Just changed the names of the sanctions." Another official smirked behind his program, whispering, "If I hear Russian strength one more time, I'm going to fall asleep." Even a younger bureaucrat, no older than 30, checked his phone under the table and quietly texted, "This dinosaur still thinks it's 2005. The disguised Putin's hands clenched tightly on his knees, but no one noticed. On stage, the real Putin continued, eyes sweeping the room, completely unaware that his own ears were hearing the cracks in his empire from the back of the hall. As the speech droned on, the disguised Putin sat perfectly still, his ears working harder than his eyes. This was his chance to hear what they really thought when they assumed he wasn't listening. And what he heard? It was nothing like the reports his advisors fed him. Two senior military officers, medals gleaming on their chests, leaned toward each other, their applause barely more than a polite tap of the hands. "Another speech about our glorious future," one of them muttered. "Meanwhile, half our equipment is older than my son." The other officer snorted. "My troops spend more time fixing trucks than training in them." Just behind them, a regional governor, a man who had publicly praised Putin on state TV just the night before, leaned toward his assistant, whispering behind his hand, If he talks about economic strength one more time, I might choke on my caviar. His assistant chuckled nervously, trying not to laugh too loud. Every factory I oversee is running on fumes, and they want us to keep inflating the numbers. Putin's hands curled into tight fists, hidden under the table. But the whispers kept coming. A young technocrat, part of a delegation from Moscow's innovation ministry, checked his phone and scoffed quietly. He still thinks we're building a tech superpower. Half my team just resigned to move to Germany. The disguised Putin's jaw tightened. But the worst came from a mid-level bureaucrat directly to his right, a man with a loose tie and sweat stains under his arms, looking like someone who had given up caring long ago. "This guy," the man muttered under his breath. "If he wasn't the boss, nobody would listen to this crap." Putin's face went stone cold. He had spent years, decades, building a system where loyalty wasn't optional. Yet here, in his own hand-picked audience, they weren't just bored. They were mocking him, dismissing him. And the worst part? They all still clapped on cue, smiling when the cameras panned their way, pretending they believed every word, because that was the real performance. For the first time in years, Putin realized that his fear machine still worked, but only on the surface. Beneath the applause, his grip on his own circle was rotting away. The applause echoed through the hall as the speech concluded, the crowd rising to their feet in perfect rehearsed unison. From the stage, the real Putin gave his final wave, expression calm, proud, the image of a leader in complete control. But near the back, where no cameras reached, the disguised Putin sat motionless, his hands clenching the arms of his chair so tightly, his knuckles went white. The fake smiles, the whispers of betrayal, the casual disrespect spoken with such confidence, they all swirled in his mind like a storm refusing to break. As the audience began filtering out, the disguised Putin slipped away unnoticed, exiting through a side door into a dimly lit corridor. The moment the door closed behind him, his mask came off, literally and figuratively. He ripped off the fake glasses, tore away the wig, his breathing sharp and uneven. His personal security, waiting outside, stiffened at the sight of him, face flushed with fury, a storm brewing behind his eyes. "Bring me a phone," Putin ordered, voice like steel. An aide fumbled to hand over a secure phone, his hands shaking slightly because everyone could feel it. The room itself felt colder. Putin dialed a number he rarely used himself, a direct line to the head of internal intelligence, the man responsible for monitoring loyalty within the government and military ranks. The voice on the other end answered quickly. "Yes, Mr. President?" "I want a list," Putin said, his tone slow, deliberate, the kind of voice you hear right before the trap snaps shut. "A list, sir?" "Every person who attended tonight's speech," Putin said. "Cross-reference with their internal loyalty reports, private communications, anything we have. If anyone has shown even a whisper of disloyalty, I want their file on my desk by morning." The aide hesitated. "And if we find something?" Putin's eyes narrowed. "Then you know what to do." The call ended. Silence swallowed the hallway. But Putin wasn't done. He turned to his chief speechwriter, who stood trembling at the far end of the corridor. "Next time," Putin said coldly, "write me something they're too afraid to mock." The speechwriter swallowed hard and nodded, knowing full well that the next speech wouldn't just be about policy. It would be a reminder of who held the leash. As Putin strode down the hallway toward his motorcade, the face he wore was no longer a disguise, but it wasn't the face from the stage either. It was the face of a man who had seen behind the curtain and found nothing but rot. And for Vladimir Putin, that was more dangerous than any foreign enemy could ever be. The next morning, the sun rose over Moscow, but inside the Kremlin, the air was thick with fear. A secret loyalty review had been ordered overnight, and by dawn, dozens of names had been flagged. Officials, advisors, military officers, even speechwriters. Their private messages, off-the-record conversations, and quiet jokes told behind closed doors had all been scraped, analyzed, and laid bare. By midday, several of those names were quietly removed from their posts, some reassigned to remote offices in Siberia, others placed on sudden medical leave. A few simply disappeared altogether. Inside the same hall where the speech had been given just hours before, workers rushed to replace seating charts, removing placards, pretending certain people had never even existed. The remaining officials took notice, and the message was clear. If you whisper about the king hears you. In his private office, Putin sat alone, the disguise from the night before crumpled on his desk like a discarded skin. His tea went cold, untouched. His gaze fixed not on reports or briefings, but on his own reflection in the window. He had seen something that no advisor, no intelligence report, no rehearsed propaganda could ever show him. The truth. They feared him, but they no longer respected him. They smiled at the cameras and clapped when they were told to. But beneath the surface, they saw him as a relic, a man so desperate to project strength that he couldn't see how weak his grip had become. For all his control, all his surveillance, all his power, Putin had finally learned the one thing no autocrat ever wants to know. The fear machine works until it doesn't. He could replace every official in the room, fire every general, rewrite every speech, but he couldn't rewrite what they thought of him. And for a man who built his empire on loyalty and fear, that realization wasn't just humiliating. It was terrifying. As night fell over Moscow, Putin made a decision. The next speech, there would be no whispers, because there wouldn't be anyone left bold enough to whisper at all.